The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we present excerpts from Thinkers of the East by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. How and what to understand. This interchange between the Sufi mystic Simab and a nobleman named Mulakab is preserved in oral transmission as a dialogue often staged by wandering dervishes. Mulakab: Tell me something of your philosophy so that I may understand. Simab: You cannot understand unless you have experienced. Mulakab: I do not have to understand a cake to know whether it is bad. Simab: If you are looking at a good fish and you think that it is a bad cake, you need to understand less and to understand it better, more than you need anything else. Mulakab: Then why do you not abandon books and lectures if experience is the necessity? Simab: Because the outward is the conductor to the inward. Books will teach you something of the outward aspects of the inward, and so will lectures. Without them you would make no progress. Mulakab: But why should we not be able to do without books? Simab: For the same reason that you cannot think without words. You have been reared on books. Your mind is so altered by books and lectures, by hearing and speaking, that the inward can only speak to you through the outward, whatever you pretend you can perceive. Mulakab: Does this apply to everyone? Simab: It applies to whom it applies. It applies above all to those who think it does not apply to them. Displacement. A Sufi sheikh was asked why he did not accept the leadership of a group of disciples who wished to transfer their allegiance to him from their former leader. He said, It is like the condition of a plant or another growing thing. To place oneself at the head of something which is dying is to partake oneself of the dying capacity of that thing. Individual parts can continue to flourish, especially if reinforced by something with greater truth. But the plant itself, when it has the power of death in it, will transfer that tendency of death to whatever connects with it as a whole. Someone asked him, But what was the situation in those historical instances when reformers and others have in fact taken over the headship of an activity, and it has gone on to greater strength? He said, Such were not teaching schools, but worldly activities which were only imagined by external observers and superficialists to be real entities. Dividing camels. There was once a Sufi who wanted to make sure that his disciples would, after his death, find the right teacher of the way for them. He therefore, after the obligatory bequests laid down by law, left his disciples 17 camels with this order. You will divide the camels among the 3 of you in the following proportions. The oldest shall have half, the middle in age 1/3, and the youngest shall have 1/9. As soon as he was dead and the will was read, the disciples were at first amazed at such an inefficient disposition of their master's assets. Some said, Let us own the camels communally. Others sought advice and then said, We have been told to make the nearest possible division. Others were told by a judge to sell the camels and divide the money, and yet others held that the will was null and void because its provisions could not be executed. Then they fell to thinking that there might be some hidden wisdom in the master's bequest, so they made inquiries as to who could solve insoluble problems. Everyone they tried failed, until they arrived at the door of the son-in-law of the Prophet, Hazrat Ali. He said, "This is your solution. I will add 1 camel to the number. Out of the 18 camels you will give half, 9 camels, to the oldest disciple. The second shall have 1/3 of the total, which is 6 camels. The last disciple may have 1/9, which is 2 camels. That makes 17. 1, my camel, is left over to be returned to me." This was how the disciples found the teacher for them. Revolting. "What is your view about inner knowledge?" asked the mild-mannered dervish Abdur of the traditionalistic theologian Abdurrashid of Adana. "I have no patience with it." "And what else?" "It makes me sick." "And what else?" "The idea is revolting." "How interesting," said Abdur, "that a logical and trained mind like yours, when asked for a view on a matter, can only describe, instead, 3 personal moods." Laws. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid was sitting in disguise one evening in a company of dervishes. One of those present said, "Rules can only function well with people for whom they were explicitly prepared." Harun, who was dressed as a visiting merchant, objected. "But surely this is a dangerous doctrine, for it would mean, if believed, that people could deny that laws apply to them." A Sufi ancient who was present said, "Such a lack of understanding is, in reality, rare. If, on one of his secret nightly visits to various parts of this city, the Caliph heard of the belief in the limitation of laws, he might indeed be shallow enough to summon us to answer the following morning at his court. Otherwise, it is not harmful." Example. Once upon a time, there was a dervish whose reputation, due to his spiritual and temporal achievements, increased as the years passed. One day he decided to marry. To the amazement of all who knew him, he chose the most evil-tempered woman for many miles around. A certain wandering Baba visiting him not long after his wedding could not restrain his curiosity at the sight of this saintly man, constantly interrupted and criticized by a stupid woman. He asked his host to explain the reason. The dervish said, "Brother, when you penetrate beyond the obvious, many things become clear. My wife's harangues, as it happens, prevent me from becoming too overbearing. Without her, my position as a sage might go to my head. Besides, there is always the chance that she may see, by contrasting her own conduct with mine, that she could modify her rudeness and ensure her own celestial bliss." "Imitation of the wise is indeed a thing to practice," said the Baba to himself. He was profoundly moved by the explanation, and as soon as he arrived back at his own home, he married the foulest-tempered woman he could find. She reviled him before his friends, relations, and disciples. But his meekness only increased her scorn and derision. Before many months had passed, the Baba's wife had driven herself mad. She became so accustomed to bullying people without producing any reaction that one day she started an argument with an even more vicious woman, who killed her. The widower Baba took to the wandering life again, and eventually found himself once more at the house of the dervish to whom he recited his story. The dervish said, "If you had asked me, instead of rushing to practice a half-understood principle, I would have told you that it was not a general rule, and how to put it into operation in the individual case. In trying to do good to yourself, you have done evil to others. The miracle. Imam Ali, according to the Durud-i-Qasimi, admitted a barbarian stranger to his presence, in spite of the trepidation of those around him. Less than 15 minutes had passed before the Imam said to his companions, "This man will become a saint when he leaves this house, and his powers will seldom be excelled." Since Hadrat Ali had done no more than raise his right hand over the newcomer's head, his disciples asked one another why they could not receive a similar blessing, so that they could instantly be transformed in a like manner. Ali said, "This man had humility. As a consequence, I was able to impart barakah to him. Failure to exercise humility has made you difficult to act upon, because you are your own barrier. If you want proof of this arrogance, here it is. The humble man would assume that he could not learn without great effort and much time. Consequently, he will learn easily and quickly. The arrogant imagine that they are ready and agitate for the barakah, refusing to entertain even the thought that they are unworthy. To be unworthy is one thing. To fail to realize that it is possible is another, and worse. Even worse is to imagine that one is humble or trying to be sincere when one is not. Worst of all is to think nothing until one sees someone, such as the barbarian stranger, to whom one feels so superior that one's actions become uncontrolled. Every luxury. There was once a Sufi who was also a gifted businessman, and he accumulated much wealth. Another man, visiting him, was appalled by his obvious riches, and he said, "I have just been to see such and such a Sufi. Do you know he was surrounded by every luxury?" When this was reported to the Sufi, he said, "I knew that I was surrounded by almost every luxury, but not every single one. Now I know that on the day that man came, my collection of luxuries was complete." Someone asked him what the final luxury had been. The final luxury is to have someone to envy you. Unsuitable. A king who had amassed great wealth and many domains decided that he should become a dervish. He said, "People universally respect these Sufi people, and it is not fitting that I, the king, should not partake of the merit which characterizes them." So he called a venerable dervish sage and asked to be enrolled in the path of wisdom. The dervish said, "With all respect and every regret, Your Majesty, you will never pass the test." The king said, "Just try me, for it is possible that I might. After all, I have been successful in all my endeavors thus far in my life." The dervish said, "Majesty, it would be improper for me to attempt a test which I know you will fail, for this is wasting effort and an absurdity. If, however, you agree to the examination taking place in open durbar, then I could agree, since your very failure might teach others present the problems of the dervish way." So the king agreed, and the court was convened. "Let the examination proceed," said the king. "Very well," said the dervish. "I want you to answer, 'Yes, I believe you,' to every statement which I make." "Well, that sounds easy enough," said the king. "Say on." The dervish then said, 1,000 years ago I ascended into the heavens." "Yes, I believe you," said the king. "And as the generations passed, I did not age like other people," said the dervish. "Yes, I believe you," said the king. I travelled to places where the rain fell upwards and the sun was cold, and the people were smaller than the insects, said the dervish. Yes, I believe you, said the king. And, said the dervish, I managed to teach people who did not want to be taught, and I could not teach people who wanted to be taught. And when I was lying, people thought I was telling the truth, and when I was saying only truth, they imagined that I was lying. Yes, I believe you, said the king. On one of my journeys, I came across your own parents, and they were liars, deceivers, and paying a dreadful penalty for their crimes, said the dervish. That is a lie, shouted the king. I do not believe a word of it. Syed Sultan. Syed Sultan said, If you pray and feel satisfaction at having prayed, your action has made you worse. In such circumstances, cease to pray until you have learnt how to be really humble. This podcast is copyright 2016, the Idries Shah Foundation.